Hello, this is Will from Camas Books and Info Shop, and I'm here on the Seeds of Revolution podcast today with Deondre Smiles, an assistant professor in the geography department at the University of Victoria and director of the Geographic Indigenous Futures Laboratory. Hi, Deondre. Thank you for joining us.
Of course. Well, thanks for having me.
Would you like to introduce yourself and situate yourself for the folks listening at home?
Of course. So, hello, everyone. Buju Hanin, Neo Kamigabo and Diznakaz, Deondre Smiles and Diznakaz Zaganashimoan. So, my Ojibwe name is Neo Kamigabo. My English name, the name on my driver's license and pretty much every legal document, is Deondre Smiles. I'm a citizen of the Leech-Lake Band Ojibwe, Bullhead Clan, and I'm an assistant prof here in the Department of Geography at UVic, which is located on Lekwungen-speaking Sangis-Esquimalt, ultimately Saanich lands here in what's colonially known as Victoria, BC. Been here since 2021. And I'm also the director of the Geographic Indigenous Futures Collaboratory, which is a research space here in the Department of Geography that focuses on community-based work with Indigenous communities.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I know that you have been involved in the People's Park, which is the Palestine Solidarity encampment that is in the quad space of the University of Victoria. That went up May 1st, and as of recording, it's been about 2 months that the students have been out there. Can you describe your role with the People's Park, and also if you'd like to highlight any events that have happened over the past 2 months?
Yeah, so a lot has happened over the past 2 months, and so I don't know. As far as role, because really I view myself as a supporter of the students, and so I've done a number of things to help support them, such as kind of have been a body on the ground to help keep the students safe, have done advocacy for the encampment on behalf of the encampment with the university administration. I was a witness for the students in 2 meetings that they had with the university admin. Have helped with fellow faculty in trying to get motions passed in our union, the UVic Faculty Association, to try to condemn what's going on in Gaza and in support of the encampments, and have been doing, I guess, a fair bit of media coverage related to the encampment. And so I had an interview with CBC Radio, the radio show All Points West, had a TV interview with Czech News, actually had a couple of TV interviews with Czech News, and then also was interviewed by the Times Colonist. And so it's been a lot of advocacy on behalf of the students. I always want to be really careful that I'm not here to speak for the students, that I don't have a formal role in the camp, because I don't think that that's what the camp is about. And I'm always hesitant as a faculty member, as somebody that occupies a different power position than the students do, to insert myself into a space that is not really a space for me to take center stage in.
You've been doing a lot of advocacy work, as you've said, and you've been speaking a lot to the media. What are some of the largest mischaracterizations about the People's Park that you've been noticing?
Right. And so probably the biggest one that I think is indicative of many encampments across the United States and Canada is that it's an inherently anti-Semitic space, that it's a space of Jew hatred and a space that is inherently hostile to the Jewish faith and Jewish communities in the cities where these encampments are going on. I can say from my own personal experience that there are a decent amount of Jewish folks in camp that have taken up leadership roles, and there's folks from the local Jewish community here in Victoria that have stepped up in support of the camp. Any kind of critique about this oftentimes comes from Zionists who may be Jewish. A lot of Zionists are actually not Jewish, right, but are folks on the political right that have aligned themselves with the Israeli government and with Zionist kind of organizations and individuals in order to kind of further their own religious fundamentalist kind of point of view. So that is one really big misconception that I want to try to put to bed right away. The second misconception is that these encampments are inherently violent and that they pose a public safety risk. I can say for myself that that encampment has never put me at risk physically, at least from the members in the encampment. As a matter of fact, The risk to my safety have come from outside agitators who have come to try to harass and assault members of the encampment. There was a fellow that was covered in the news for assaulting a few encampment members and supporters. He actually shoved me to the ground when trying to storm into the encampment and try to attack students, as well as like the very militarized police presence on campus and heavily securitized presence. I think those things, to me, have been more of a danger to me than anybody in the encampments. And I think the third kind of misconception, right, is that these students in the encampment and other community members are essentially asking for impossible things from the university. They've published a list of demands, and people will often critique them and say, well, they're asking for the impossible. If people actually took a second to read through the demands and understand where they're coming from, they would find that these are things that are perfectly achievable and doable by the university.
And speaking about the university's response, both the securitization as well as uh, the response to the demands and the negotiations, which you've been a witness for, is there anything you'd like to speak to about how the university has been handling the situation?
Yeah, I think the university has been ham-fisted at best. They've been extremely reactive to what's been going on. They've made a series of public relation gaffes. One of the biggest ones was when there was an installation of a surveillance camera on top of the library that myself and other faculty and folks in the encampment saw with our own eyes. The university, in the response to that allegation, essentially at first was, well, there's no camera there. We don't know what you're talking about. Then the next kind of shift was, well, we acknowledge that there was a camera there, but it was never meant to be operational. We were testing it out. And now the latest that I've heard is that there's been a bit of passing the buck where the administration says, oh, well, campus security set this up and we really didn't know anything about it until, it was up and being tested. And so there's been that, the fact that the university president, Kevin Hall, when he has engaged at all with anything related to the encampment, it's been via a series of often contradictory statements that he's kind of let his vice presidents and provosts kind of do any kind of engagement when they felt bothered to. The first meeting between the encampment and anybody from the university was the director of student life and then somebody from bikes athletics, both of whom had no power whatsoever to make any kind of commitment or any kind of agreement surrounding the demands that the encampment placed. And so it's just been a very fumbly response. It's been very slow. It's been reactive, where the university is constantly reacting very quickly and very forcefully to things rather than trying to be proactive and trying to meet the students where they're at. The university has kind of characterized this encampment as a spontaneous, very disruptive protest rather than the end result of over 7 months now of the university essentially turning a blind eye and plugging its ears to students trying to ask the university to engage in a meaningful way. And so I would say UVic's response has not been great. I think that they've been trying to look and see what other universities are doing. I get the sense they're looking at the U of T and UBC, which is why they've been relatively slow, because they've been seeing like these injunctions trying to be filed and the legal wrangling. And this is not new. UVic, I know, when during the COVID response, waited for Simon Fraser and UBC to do things before they decided to do them, such as late starts to the terms or masking requirements, vaccination requirements. And so it's kind of another example of UVic being a follower rather than a leader, which it should be at a time like this.
And this is quite different from UVic's role and being perceived to be a leader from divesting from fossil fuels. That students had a protest. They chained themselves outside the administrative building shortly before I arrived as a PhD student here. So it seems to be quite a turn away from past orientations to student activism and leadership. Speaking of how hierarchical and bureaucratized and slow and siloed the university's response has been, can you give the listeners a better idea of the principles for organizing the People's Park of the encampment? I know they've published various principles and guidelines on their Instagram page to share with people. But for those who haven't been there yet.
Mhm. So I would say it's a very horizontal space power wise. And so there's been people that have been kind of identified as like spokespeople for the camp, but they would be the first to say like they don't have like official leadership roles, that they're kind of they've stepped into that role just by the endorsement of their fellow campers. And so it's a very horizontally organized space. It's non-hierarchical. It's something too where people have said, oh well, faculty are like the leaders of this encampment. And I can say as a faculty member, like I have nothing I had nothing to do with setting up the encampment. They function largely independent of us. If we are involved, it's by their request and then by their consent. And so I think they really have focused on mutual aid to each other, right? And so actually the space itself has been a space where people come to share a meal, or people go for medical care, or people go for supplies. It's been something too that's very focused on democratic consensus and in mass decision making. That it's not just one person making the decision for the camp or for collective action, but it's something that's deliberated upon by the encampment themselves. There's been something where I know the encampment has been very mindful about the fact that they are on Indigenous land and that they're trying to center Indigenous protocols, but also they're trying to ensure that they don't fall into the trap that a lot of other movements in settler colonies do, where white settlers kind of take up a lot of space. They've been very mindful of that as well. So very hierarchical or very horizontal space. No hierarchies. I would almost say it's probably something that's a little bit closer than not to almost an anarchist space in a way.
Yeah, and that's been my interpretation
Mhm.
of the space when I've been on the camp as well. So speaking, guys, as a faculty member and a
Mhm.
community member more broadly
Mhm.
outside of the encampment, can you share what you've done in response to the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip?
Yes. And so part of it is that I taught a lecture by student request on what's been happening. Um, this happened during spring term in my political and economic geography class, where a number of students approached me and said, "Hey, we would like to have a lecture focusing on what's been happening." And so I started to organize that lecture. Because of kind of the inherent danger involved in teaching such a topic, right? It was something where I consulted with my department and I really kind of dove deep into literature, some which you provided to me, Will, and really tried to at least do a lecture that focused on the history in the background of the conflict without getting into the conflict itself. Part of the reason why I chose to do that, right, is because I'm teaching, this was an 88-person class where there were students from different political backgrounds, and I wanted them to at least understand like a more straightforward history behind this, because a lot of people know what's going on here in the present day. They don't understand the historical kind of origins of what's been going on. And I mean, I think I probably started closer in history than I probably could have, right? I started in about the 1920s. I probably could have gone back even decades or even centuries before that. And so I taught the lecture. Was very, very well received. As a matter of fact, it was something in my student evals. The students were almost unanimously appreciative for it. One of the other things I've been doing has been really trying to amplify Palestinian voices through my social media presence. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I have about 25,000 followers. And so I've been really trying to amplify those sorts of voices. I've been trying to donate to Palestinian causes. I've been giving my time and energy and resources at the encampment. And, there's always more that could be done, right? But those are sorts of the things that are within my wheelhouse. And also keeping in mind the fact that I'm a pre/slash non-tenured faculty member. I'm a visible minority in my department. I'm teaching about these sorts of things. There are websites out there such as Canary Mission that are Zionist ran websites that are designed to dox people who are critical of Israel and then speak out against it. And so while I'm not too concerned about being on the website, I'm kind of surprised I'm not on there with how vocal I've been. One of the things is obviously, I want to try to keep my safety and the safety of my family in mind as well. And so that's kind of tempered it to a certain degree. But it's been something where in the areas where I can speak up, I'm going to. That was one of the things with the encampment, actually, where I know it would be easy for me as a faculty member to be like, oh, well, I don't need to worry about that. That's their deal. I'd rather just sit cushy in my office and not worry about the risks of my career. But I have students that are in the encampment, and I also think back to the George Floyd uprising back in 2020, which was in my hometown of Minneapolis, and I was 800 miles away in the middle of a pandemic, not able to make it back and support people in my city. And so I kind of told myself if there was an opportunity that arose to be able to be part of something to kind of speak out, like, in favor of justice and trying to push back against colonization, these things, I'm going to take the opportunity. And so this encampment, I happened to actually see them on the first day when they were setting it up, and I spoke to them and said, "Hey, what can I do to help?" And so, accounting for travel and things like that, I've been pretty much involved there ever since. Mhm.
And I wanted to um, talk a little bit more about your experience teaching the students and engaging with the students at the encampment. What's your evaluation of how students have engaged with the situation in Palestine? I mean, oftentimes they're portrayed as naive or idealistic or kind of unwilling, perhaps. The students are not a monolithic group, but
Mhm.
just from your evals and the positive response. So I was wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, students, at least in my course, were very appreciative. As I mentioned, they were really grateful for the opportunity to kind of learn more about the history, because a lot of times in the news, there's not a focus on the historical kind of viewpoint. The kind of the idea behind media coverage is essentially this current conflict started on October 7th, and that was the beginning of everything, and anything before that's not worth analysis. And I try to explain that October 7th really was a end result, or another kind of chapter in a long history in this conflict there in Palestine. And so the students appreciated it. I mean, even if the students didn't agree with me when I lectured about it, I was very facts based. I was very focused on, I tried to avoid editorializing. I tried to give a very straightforward academic analysis of what's going on here. And so they've appreciated that. Students in the university more broadly, I've often found, have kind of fallen into three groups. And so there's one group that is very anti-encampment, that they view them as disruptive. They basically have been like, the UVic subreddit is a really, really good example of this, where there's been people saying, well, why haven't the police been called in? These folks are disruptive. They shut down the campus Starbucks. They're there on the campus quad and yelling things and shouting slogans and playing music. And, I want them off of here. I don't feel safe. There is a group in the middle where I think there's students, and this is summertime right now. And so, our full complement of like 27,000 students or however many we have is not here, right? But the students that have been here, there's a middle group that are essentially kind of apathetic to it. They've said, well, what can you do, right? Like, it's terrible what's going on, but what do you expect the university to do? I don't really want to bother myself with this. I just want to focus on getting my degree and trying to pass my classes, my courses, and get through. And then there's a group of students who, outside of the ones in the encampment, that have been like, they're doing a good thing. Like, we need to be calling attention to this. This is a genocide that's going on in Palestine right now, and we support the encampment. And so I've often found that they fall within those three groups, and there's obvious different shades of gray within these groups, right? And some people are more anti-encampment than others. Some people might just view it as a basic annoyance. But at least I've found that, the students that do engage, a lot of them are informed, right? Whether they disagree with the encampment or agree with the encampment. There's a few that essentially have kind of bought what the media is portraying about it, right? And haven't bothered to do any kind of analysis with it. But I mean, that's their right. You can't force them to become well read or become knowledgeable fully about the what's been going on in Palestine and the current war in Gaza. But I have found that the students that do educate themselves, no matter what side they fall on, are at least prepared to have a more nuanced, more productive conversation.
And before we move to talk about settler colonialism more broadly, both here and in Palestine, I did want to um, take a moment to ask you what you think the role of the university is in times of crisis. There seem to be a variety of opinions on what the university is for, and what ownership students have over the university and the direction that university should take. there is really a struggle over what the space of the university should be used for, especially in regards to crises that are happening both here as well as around the world.
That's a really, really good question. And so I think just to start the answer, I have to kind of explain what I view the role of the university is in general, which is a space of discourse and a space of knowledge production and a space of intellectual exchange. And so the university in my mind is a place where people come to learn, to be in conversation with one another, and to exit the university as, fundamentally transformed, intellectually, personally. And so in times of crisis, I think that the university can really be a generative space for very fruitful conversations about what's going on, about the issues that face us as humanity, whether it's political issues, social issues, cultural issues, environmental issues, right? Like the climate crisis, for example. And I think that the university really should uphold that freedom to have those sorts of conversations. Now, the word academic freedom gets tossed around an awful lot related to this, and we'll probably get a little bit further into that here. But kind of the idea that that people should be free to be able to espouse their views gets weaponized oftentimes in really non-productive ways, where it kind of feels like people that are advocating for genocide or espousing racist and xenophobic views kind of fall back on this argument like, well, it's my academic freedom in order to talk about this. Meanwhile, students who are talking about decolonization, talking about genocide, talking about settler colonialism, they find themselves kind of being hemmed in various ways, being viewed as disruptive, or, as I mentioned, like websites like Canary Mission that are designed to basically surveil and dox people that are speaking out against settler colonialism in Palestine. Speaking as somebody that, my students in political and economic geography, I made no secret of the fact that like I'm on the left politically, right? And I talked about that. But it was one of the things when I wanted to lecture about Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and even when delivering a lecture that I felt was very neutral politically, right? And I did that on purpose because I didn't want to give anybody a foothold to try to claim that I'm trying to indoctrinate students or trying to teach biased things in a classroom. Even there, I still felt really super nervous. I found myself kind of scanning the audience, being like, is there a student recording me with a phone, right? Are they going to take pictures of my slides? Is it something where I'm going to find where I'm going to get doxxed and get death threats in my email inbox, or, have to watch myself as I'm walking out to my car because somebody, a local Zionist, might take issue with what I taught and decide to harass me. This kind of happens on one side, right? On the other side, I don't know. I don't think there's like a Palestinian website that's doxing pro-Israeli academics, right? Or surveilling them or things like that. So but those are the people that fall on academic freedom. Meanwhile, myself, I almost have to feel like I have to self-censor myself in order to not deal with any kind of harassment in what I teach. I'm very knowledgeable, again, as a pre-tenured academic, that, going to the media and talking about these sorts of things, I'm sticking my neck out really far for a professor that's 2 years away from tenure still, right? But it's one of those things where it's like, I would rather be able to speak freely and use my position in the way that it's meant to be, right? As somebody that's trying to help generate knowledge and trying to facilitate discourse, rather than self-censor and mute myself so that other folks can feel comfortable with genocide. That's not, as an Indigenous academic, that's not what I'm here for. That'd be a slap in the face of my community, who sacrificed to get me here if I decided to be quiet there.
So throughout our conversation so far, you've drawn solidarities and connections between the Palestinian encampments and the students' solidarity and your own solidarity with Palestine, with both Indigenous peoples and Indigenous movements here, as well as the response to Floyd's murder and anti-Black violence generally in the United States. Can you speak to these kinds of relationships between settler colonialism here, often called Turtle Islands, and in Palestine, and how you kind of see these kind of internationalist movements working in concert?
Right, that's a great question. And so I think that the guiding principle of terra nullius, which is the Latin term for no man's land and is the central logic of settler colonialism, really plays true both here in North America and in Palestine in North America and both Canada and the United States. The myth is essentially that settlers came and found it depends. Some people say, well, it was uninhabited, or other people say, well, the indigenous peoples were so bad at using the land productively that it might as well be uninhabited. Is one of the examples I often use when I teach about this was, the quotation from a British naval captain here on the west coast of Vancouver Island that essentially said, before we came along, you indigenous peoples didn't know how to do anything with the land, right? And we had to teach you how. And so you see that here in North America and Palestine. You hear the Israeli kind of settler colonial myth of making the desert bloom, that Jewish immigrants from Europe who were persecuted in Europe, right, in the Holocaust and in various pogroms, in Eastern Europe came to Israel and essentially were transformed into this hyper masculine framing of Judaism where they were able to take control of the land and be able to turn it into a productive agricultural powerhouse. Notwithstanding the fact that the local Palestinians had been doing that already for generations, right? And oftentimes were pushed off of their land. The stories of cutting down olive trees and uprooting farms. And so that's kind of one area where there's a lot of similarity. The other similarity is about kind of the geographic fragmentation of any kind of indigenous land claims. And so in the United States and Canada, we have, reservations in the states and reserves here in Canada, which are these lands that were set aside for indigenous peoples to have some modicum of self-government over, which of course that's eroded quite regularly. And if you take a look at the territories, are oftentimes far away from those indigenous peoples' historic territories or fragmented in a way to kind of prevent them from having any meaningful control over them. I think about, for example, my own nation, the Leech Lake Nation, where we, on our reservation, thanks to the American policy of allotment and kind of the slow swindling away of our land, we only own like 4 or 5% of the land on our reservation. And so you see that, and then you take a look at places like the West Bank, where under the Oslo agreements in the early 1990s, there were people who say that Oslo was a step towards Palestinian independence. If you take a look at actually how Israel managed to maneuver that agreement, it basically set up 3 different kind of property regimes in the West Bank, where there was an area where there was solely under Palestinian control, and then there are areas where there was kind of shared responsibility, and then set aside, didn't really fully deal with the fact that there were Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And so if you take a look at the boundaries of land control in the West Bank now, any Palestinian land is very fragmented. And the Israelis do that on purpose, and they want it that way, right? Because they're very mindful that in their pre-67 borders, before they expanded into the West Bank and Gaza, the narrowest part of Israel is something like 9 or 10 miles wide, right? And so there's always kind of this thought of like our borders are indefensible as they are, and so we need to have a strong security presence in the Golan Heights and in the West Bank and in Gaza to ensure that we can defend ourselves. And so they've allowed settlements to encroach further into Palestinian land, and that's set up like a border wall and have roads that only Israeli settlers can drive on. And have essentially allowed this to continue unabated, right? And there's a little bit of difference where in Gaza, what's going on there, where that was recognized as Palestinian territory, even if under Hamas control. In the West Bank, Israel has been annexing land that has been recognized as Palestinian land, and they know that it's illegal under international law, and they don't care. And so that is kind of another way. And then the third way really has been kind of the dominance of settler culture. And so in the United States and Canada, indigenous peoples essentially still kind of are relegated to like a second-class political existence, even in places like Canada, where there's a lot of lip service paid to indigeneity in the federal government. Indigenous peoples are still very shackled by the Indian Act of 1876 and shackled by status. In the United States, we have blood quantum and, kind of being federally recognized as shackles. In Israel itself, Israeli Arabs are kind of marginalized out of political systems. I know that there's been a few Israeli Arab members of the Knesset, but they don't have any kind of meaningful power. Israel kind of sidelines them away from the military and anything sensitive, right? Because they kind of unofficially view them as I forget whether it's a third column or a fifth column kind of within Israeli society. And so there's kind of this sense, right? To say nothing of, even the racial stratification of Israeli society, where like Ethiopian Jews, for example, were brought from Ethiopia, but still are kind of afforded kind of a lower political existence than European descended Israelis. And so there's, this kind of land dispossession, there's kind of these political, geographical fragmentations, and then there's this racial hierarchical kind of division of society, right? Where white settlers are kind of placed at the top, and people below that really don't get to fully embrace political life.
And then finally, I want to connect I would like you to speak on the connection between settler colonialism and genocide, because as it's reported in the news and sometimes discussed popularly, it seems from some of these discussions that people are speaking as if the genocide started on October 7th when the Israelis responded to Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, when Hamas and their allies invaded the settler territories. But I think that you can speak to it, that settler colonialism is inherently kind of a genocidal regime.
It is. And this would be something where kind of the quote grandfather of settler colonial studies, Patrick Wolfe, and I would probably disagree, because Patrick Wolfe says, well, settler colonialism is not always uniformly genocidal. And I would say that, well, actually, if you take a look at the base definition of settler colonialism, which is the occupation of land and the marginalization of indigenous peoples, genocide is like quite literally baked into the ways that settler colonialism kind of destroys to replace. And so the idea, for example, here in the United States and Canada, was that you would build a settler society kind of on indigenous land, and that indigenous peoples and their cultures would, if not eliminated outright, would kind of be viewed as kind of lesser or something to be subsumed into the larger body politic kind of national level, right? And so while in the United States, we've kind of had this brutal genocide where essentially indigenous presence, if it's acknowledged at all, is essentially kind of treated as a sideshow. Canada has approached it as, well, indigenous peoples really need to just blend into the multicultural mosaic of Canada, where we have the official policy of multiculturalism. And so the idea that you'll oftentimes hear from folks is like, well, what makes indigenous people so special, right? Why don't they just assimilate into the Canadian way of life? And yes, they can celebrate their culture, they can celebrate their own existence, but it can be something that's part of the broader spectrum of Canadian identity. Genocide, like, people think that genocide is brutally murdering entire populations of people. And that is true. That is genocidal, right? That is going on in Gaza right now. That has been going on in Palestine. But also the idea is that genocide is also the gradual erosion of indigenous identity and the self-indigenization of the settler themselves. And so they can fully replace the indigenous person as the indigenous people. And so you see that a little bit in the United States and Canada, where folks are like, well, I was born in Canada. My ancestors were born in Canada, right? I'm Canadian. I'm not a settler. Oh, I'm a Native American because I was born here in the United States. It doesn't matter if my ancestors were European. We've lived here for 150 years. In the Israeli context, you see the Israeli government and Zionists, allies, and the Zionists themselves saying, no, we are the indigenous peoples of this land, right? The Palestinians, the Arabs came from elsewhere. Like, we're just returning back home to our home territories. And so, it's played out via brutal physical genocide, right? But it's also kind of played out via this kind of, slow, what should I say, slow kind of co-opting of indigenous identity, where they can essentially turn around and say, well, you're not special, right? Because really we're the indigenous peoples. Like, you're a bunch of settlers yourselves. Like, you should be gone. Like, we're just coming back home. And so you see this kind of genocide through in all three contexts, right? In the United States, Canada, Palestine. You see this through physical violence. You see this through the marginalization of indigenous identity. You see this through kind of cultural assimilation, cultural erosion. And all of these things, really the goal is simply for the indigenous person to kind of be out of the way completely, right? To disappear one way or another. In the 21st century, states like the United States and Israel have kind of said, like, try to position themselves as being moralistic and trying to say, well, we're trying not to kill people, right? But genocide doesn't need to be physical in order to proceed, right? We can also see cultural genocide, for example. So how's that for an answer?
Excellent, Chimigwech. Thank you so
Yeah, of
much,
course.
Deondre.
Yes.
If there's anything you would like to add to the end of the podcast, this is your chance now. If you'd like to shout out or
Just thank you for having me on, and I send my best to the encampment, and I hope that they will continue to do good work, right? Free Palestine and from the river to the sea.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.